Good morning, and welcome to the American History Book Club. It is my honor to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. John McCardell. First, a quick question. Have you ever met someone for the first time and knew immediately that you wanted to know more about him or her? Well, that is exactly the way I felt when I first met Dr. McCardell. He's a native of Maryland and is recognized as one of our country's most distinguished historians. He's also respected as a national leader in liberal arts education. A prolific writer, Dr. McCardell's articles, essays, and book reviews usually concentrate on the Old South of the 19th century. Kind of sounds like us. The book he's reviewing today is the one he wrote in 1979, entitled The Idea of a Southern Nation. The book was an outgrowth of his dissertation at Harvard and was written under the supervision of Dr. David Herbert Donnell, another one of America's great historians. You probably have some of the books in your library if you look for them. I certainly did. Dr. McCardell's book was nominated for the Allen Nevins Prize. No surprise here, it won that prestigious award. After Harvard, Dr. McCardell became a history professor at Middlebury College, and from 1991 until 2004, he served that college as its president. From Middlebury, Dr. McCardell accepted an invitation from Sewanee, University of the South, to become president of that university, and he served there for more than 10 years. With the pending retirement next year comes another relocation. Since 2004, John and his wife Bonnie have had a place in Beaufort. You can actually begin to trace their journey south, beginning with birth in Maryland, then on to school in Massachusetts, then to Vermont, then to Tennessee, and finally to a place where we can call him one of our own in South Carolina. John will teach one more class in the spring semester at Sewanee, but in the meantime, he's working on a study about January the 1st, 1863 in Beaufort, where the first Emancipation Proclamation was first read publicly to a crowd mainly made up of people who had spent their entire lives as slaves. Dr. McCardell serves on the board of directors of the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities, which he chaired in 2015, as well as a trustee of Washington and Lee University, and today he is a very active member of the South Carolina Historical Association Board of Managers. As I mentioned earlier, the topic for today is his book, The Idea of a Southern Nation, a book which has become an American classic, has never gone out of print since 1979, and is available in the gift shop of the Upcountry History Museum. Dinah made sure that she picked up paperback copies because in hardback, if you can find his book, it retails for nearly $800. Good luck. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John McCardell to the American History Book Club. John?
Thank you, Emily, for that very, very gracious and generous introduction. I'm delighted to be here, and it's always a pleasure to talk to friends who are interested in the history of our country. It has been a passion of mine almost as far back as I can remember, growing up as I did during the observance of the Civil War centennial, and with grandparents who grew up on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, and with relatives who fought on both sides in that conflict. And so I suppose I was destined for this particular line of work, and I've enjoyed every minute of it, even the administrative side of it. I sometimes believe that being an historian prepares one to make decisions, if for no other reason than that the more you study the past, the more you understand complexity, the more you understand nuance, the more you understand that seldom, if ever, are things truly black and white. And that our obligation, whether as historians or as students of history, is neither to praise nor to condemn before at least we try to understand. And so I came at this topic as a graduate student rather audaciously, because who in his right mind, without at least a degree of confidence verging on hubris, would have dared to think that a dissertation on what it was that made Southerners come to believe that they constituted a separate nation would be a topic that could be encompassed in a single volume and not instead become the work of a lifetime. Well, in fact, for me, it's been both. And while as I go back and read these pages that were written more than 40 years ago, and wish that I might have said it or done it a bit differently if I had it to do over again, I also believe that it has held up pretty well, and that I hadn't realized until Emily mentioned it that I'm actually holding on to a retirement nest egg here, which I'm going to guard with my life henceforth. So thank you for joining this presentation. I suspect that very little of what I'm going to be telling you during the course of this presentation will be things that you didn't at least know something about before, or had heard something about before. But I also think that one of the roles of the historian is to try to take those things that are familiar, or that may sound familiar, and try to put them together in a particular way so as to assemble a narrative that creates an interpretation with a point of view that may help us understand those familiar things in new ways. So that's really, that was really my purpose in writing this volume, and it is my purpose as well in this presentation today. Well, I remember being asked by Professor Donald during my oral examinations in graduate school a question that has actually been with me for the entirety of my career. And he began by saying, if you were writing a history of the South, where would you begin? If you were writing a history of the South, where would you begin? Well, I must tell you, I have used that question on numerous final exams for students over the years. And I quickly came to realize, because this is what good professors and good teachers do, is that they pose questions for which there is no single correct answer. Any answer you give can be challenged. Any challenge you make can be parried. And so it becomes a question that becomes a kind of quest to try to figure out when the history of this place, this thing, these people called Southerners in the South began. And I certainly won't claim to have the last word on that subject. But perhaps these comments today will help you think a little bit about when Southern history actually began. And of course, there's an infinite number of answers to that question. But to the degree that that question turns on when this place and these people began to think of themselves as constituting a nation, one can, I think, be pretty safe in saying that that history begins, that narrative commences in the first third of the 19th century. And perhaps as good a place as any to begin is in the year 1815. Why 1815? That really begins the moment when, as the historian Richard Buell has put it in the title of a book called Securing the Revolution, that the revolution was in fact actually secured. The Americans might have thought they won their independence in the revolution itself from England, but much of the political history of the first generation of American national history involves the ways in which the escape from that relationship was less than complete. And indeed, the politics of the 1790s in many ways turns on the question of America's relationship with the rest of the world. Neutrality, as George Washington and others would have argued, or alliance with England or France, who were themselves almost in constant conflict during the last decade of the 18th century and the first decade of the 19th. And so when the War of 1812 concludes, and when the peace is finally established, Americans find themselves in 1815 facing a whole new set of possibilities and almost completely unencumbered from those burdens that had affected them during the colonial and very early national period. One evidence of that is the fact that by 1815, partisanship has virtually disappeared. You may remember from your own American history course in high school or college that the era from about 1816 to the mid-1820s is referred to as the era of good feeling. And that has to do largely with the fact that political parties have disappeared, partisanship and political divisions have largely disappeared. There is a remarkable degree of consensus about things. Great example of that is James Madison's annual message to Congress in December of 1815, where he comes out recommending many of those things that he and Jefferson had opposed in the 1790s. We need a tariff, we need a bank, we need internal improvements. There is a consensus and a remarkable degree of consensus. There is also, and this is really the more important point, the larger point, there is also a realization that this thing called America had very little in the way of precise definition. The poet Robert Frost, in a wonderful poem which he recited from memory at the inauguration of John F. Kennedy in January of 1961, The Gift Outright, a beautiful work, refers to the land being ours before we were the land's, and still unstoried, artless, unenhanced. That very much describes America in 1815, still unstoried, artless, unenhanced. And as a result of that, no surprise, there is a great deal of attention paid to attempting to define those things that make America, America, and not like some other place, but truly a distinctive place of its own. And there are several examples of this which come to mind. Edward Terrell Channing delivers a Phi Beta Kappa address at Harvard in 1818, and it's called Literary Independence. And what he says is that what this country lacks and needs is a domestic literature based upon what is peculiarly our own, our scenery, our institutions, our modes of life, our history, and the antiquities of our country. Ralph Waldo Emerson writes about the American scholar, and Noah Webster brings into print the American Dictionary of the English language. There is this understanding of a nationhood that is still ill-defined, of a nationhood that is still incomplete, and of an urgent, driving need to define those things that make this country what it is. And everywhere you look in the years following 1815, that effort is going on. And a good part of what I try to trace in this book is the way in which Southerners were fully a part of that effort, urgently attempting to define just what it was to be this thing called America, this quest for nationality, this attempt to take incompleteness and at least make it less incomplete. Keep in mind also that this quest for nationality is hardly an American phenomenon. When one looks at the history of Europe, for example, one sees nationalism rearing its head virtually at the same time, in many cases in the same way, and with very different outcomes. An interesting study could be made of quests for nationality in the United States, in Germany, and in Italy, and how those quests for nationality turned out. In one case, Germany, a very consolidated nation state. In another case, Italy, a very decentralized nation state. And in this country, something that fell somewhere in between. The important point here is to keep in mind that this quest for nationality, while seemingly unique and especially urgent in the United States, was part of a phenomenon taking place in the Western world in 19th century in other places as well. What does it mean to be a nation? What are the things we look to create this sense of nationality? And Americans go into this across the country and in a variety of ways. And my book attempts, in that respect, to look at those ways in which Southerners, who certainly at the beginning of this quest didn't think of themselves as Southerners, they thought of themselves as Americans. And so, as you begin to define those distinctively American characteristics, what do? You do exactly what Edward Terrell Channing urges the listeners of his 1818 address to do. You take those things that are familiar. You take those things that you know. You take those things that, from the best of your judgment and recollection, are American things. You write about them, you speak about them, you create institutions to foster them, and you hold them up as examples of American things. And that's exactly what is taking place in the South during this period. And we can talk about some of those in just a moment. Defining nationhood, as I try to point out in the various chapters in this book, include debates over the Constitution and its meaning, include what it means to create a distinctive American literature, what constitutes a distinct American economy, how do we deal with issues in religion and education, how do we as Southerners participate in territorial expansion, and what does all of this mean for our politics? What one comes to discover is that only gradually, only over time, does separation occur between North and South in these areas. And it does so for a very specific, very particular reason. Now, it's always a danger to try to read history backward, but I want to do that for a moment because I think it's instructive. I've often taught a class on the Civil War and historical memory. And the very first reading assignment has the students reading two documents. The first, Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and the second, some segments from Jefferson Davis's memoir, The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government. That's another lecture for another time. But how Lincoln and Davis understand the Civil War, I think, is fundamental to our understanding of what that event really means. But simply put, what Lincoln attempts to do at Gettysburg by beginning American history 77 years ago, that's how he would have answered Professor Donald's question, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. Now do the math. 1863 minus 77 takes you back to 1776. From Lincoln's perspective, the American nation began with the Declaration of Independence. Now, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary on that point, isn't there? To begin with, the Articles of Confederation, which established this thing called the United States of America, weren't even ratified until 1781. How in the world can anyone say that American nationality begins in 1776? But Lincoln eloquently and in a very few minutes makes that case. And he makes that case because he believes that American nationality, American nationhood, is based upon, as he puts it, a proposition. A proposition that all men are created equal. Not a self-evident truth, as Thomas Jefferson would have had it in 1776, but a proposition, something fragile, something debatable, something before the House that can be voted up or down. American nationality is all about a proposition. Turn to Jefferson Davis, and what you will find is I have to say, maybe more than occasionally tedious legal brief that is nonetheless pretty tightly and persuasively written. That American nationality begins with the ratification of the Constitution. The Constitution was a contract. The Constitution was a bargain. The Constitution was something that every party entered freely into and created this thing called the United States. Now, by extension, if one freely enters into a relationship, one presumably can freely choose to exit that relationship. And that was precisely what Jefferson Davis was arguing in the rise and fall of the Confederate government. And neither he nor Lincoln was wrong, but they were talking past each other. Because you either view the outcome of this process that I've written about as the endorsement, the ratification of an idea, of a proposition, the upholding of a proposition, or you view it as a response to the violation of a contract that had to be reaffirmed and upheld. That debate was resolved in 1865, but it is traceable back certainly to 1776 and to 1787, and it begins to define a cleavage in the 1820s when John C. Calhoun introduces the idea of nullification. Now again, this is a much longer talk on a different topic at a different time. But the question of what and who created the Constitution and how unconstitutional acts are to be adjudicated is an unsettled question. It's certainly an unsettled question before a judicial review is established by the Marshall Court in the first decade of the 19th century. And it becomes particularly acute in the 1790s when, as a result of what some Americans truly believe to be the excessive use of force by the federal government, the legislatures of Virginia and Kentucky pass resolutions saying the states were the parties that entered into the compact of this thing called the Constitution, and therefore it seems only logical that only the states should determine the constitutionality of particular acts. And if those acts remain in effect, the states are, in the words of both the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions, and subsequently in the words of John C. Calhoun in his exposition in protest, the states which are the parties to the contract are in duty bound to interpose themselves to arrest the evil. Now, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are never followed through on. But this doctrine of state interposition, based upon the notion that the Constitution was a compact, a contract, freely entered into by states, persists. So that when Congress enacts a tariff in the 1820s, and please understand I'm oversimplifying what is a very actually interesting and very complicated story. In response to this tariff, John C. Calhoun, representing his state and representing the agricultural interest, which he says is discriminated against because of a tariff that is a tax on imports and that requires his constituents to sell in a free market, but to buy in a protected market. This is unfair, this is discriminatory. The only solution is nullification, a word also used by Jefferson and Madison, and a word embraced by Calhoun as he advances once again this notion of state interposition. Now, once again, though nullification brings the country to the brink of division, that does not happen, and yet the doctrine of state interposition goes unchallenged and continues to be a part of Americans' political vocabulary. And I say Americans' political vocabulary because some New Englanders in 1814 also adopt the notion of state interposition in response to what they believe is the discriminatory trade practices leading up to and during the War of 1812. And they gather at Hartford and embrace the same language of state interposition if the government appears to be behaving in an unconstitutional way. So make no mistake about it, this idea of state interposition is one that has force from time to time in different parts of the country, not just in the South. Now, alongside all of this, and just about the time that the nullification crisis is coming to a head, we see the beginnings of what is really for the first time an organized anti-slavery movement. And you can almost date the beginning of this in a formal, organized way from really two events that occur almost simultaneously. One is the slave uprising in Virginia, the Nat Turner Rebellion in the summer of 1831, and the other is the first publication of The Liberator under William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, in that same year. For the most part, the issue of slavery had been settled and set aside. And the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had drawn a line. It had drawn a line through the extent of the Louisiana Territory, which was the extent of American territory. Said above this line, slavery is prohibited. Below this line, slavery is permitted. And that should be that. And for most Americans, the vast majority of Americans, that was that. But there were some Americans who believing, as Lincoln did, that the proposition was still not completely fulfilled, that slavery was wrong wherever it existed, and it needed to be eliminated wherever it existed. And that was the gist, the core of the abolitionist movement in the early 1830s. Only a very small number of Americans were abolitionists. A larger number undoubtedly, were anti-slavery. But anti-slavery did not have a political platform or a practical solution to it because the line had been drawn by the Missouri Compromise. And so there was no debate over whether slavery was permitted or prohibited in any part of the country. Which means that those who were anti-slavery would just as soon have had these abolitionists keep calm and perhaps let time resolve the slavery issue and not try to accelerate and therefore put at risk the coming of that day. Now, that's an easy argument for historians to make 200 years later. It's a difficult argument for many Americans to accept, particularly those who are descendants of slaves. But that is, in fact, the way in which this particular dispute was managed during the 1820s and the 1830s. However, as the abolitionist movement surfaces, we begin to see in the writings of Calhoun and others a recognition of the fact that this institution, which is so fundamental a part of the Southern economy and so fundamental a part of Southern society as well, can at some point in the future be put at risk if a majority should ever determine that slavery needs to be eliminated. And so Calhoun and others begin to become concerned about what may happen someday if the slaveholding states become a minority. It's no coincidence that in the wake of what I've just described, Nat Turner and abolitionism, we see the Virginia legislature in 1832 taking up a serious debate over whether emancipation should take place in Virginia. And after extended debate, the answer is no. we can't emancipate the slaves. And Thomas R. Dew, a professor at William and Mary, writes a review of the debates in the Virginia legislature that really becomes the first formal articulation of a pro-slavery argument, that slavery is, by any definition, a necessary and natural way of organizing society. By the end of the decade of the 1830s, Calhoun and others are proclaiming slavery to be a positive good. And the pro-slavery argument develops out of these several occurrences that I've just described. But the slavery question is largely kept out of the mainstream of political debate, partly because of the territorial compromise, and partly also because in 1837, Congress adopts something called a gag resolution, by which any resolution that comes to Congress talking about the emancipation of slaves is automatically and permanently tabled. We're not going to talk about it, even though there are some people talking about it. Meanwhile, this quest for nationality is going on in a great many other areas, and what we will see is the way in which eventually, perhaps inexorably, perhaps even inevitably, the slavery question intrudes in each of these areas. Take, for example, the issue of literature that I talked about before. That's a great example. One of the great Southern writers, a great South Carolinian, William Gilmore Simms, did exactly what Edward Terrell Channing urged Americans to do. Simms takes up his pen and he writes, "To be national in literature, one must needs be sectional. No one mind can fully or fairly illustrate the characteristics of any great country, and he who shall depict one section faithfully has made his proper and sufficient contribution to the great work of national illustration." Write what you know about. Write what's familiar to you. It would never occur to such a writer to think that this wasn't American. Well, this is the America I know. This is the America I live in. This is the America I've experienced. And this is the America to whose store of literature I mean to contribute generously. Once again, Simms was not alone. The great New England writer, Nathaniel Hawthorne, agrees. He writes, "New England is quite as large a lump of earth as my heart can really take in." Devotion to the nation stems from loyalties that were immediate and local. And so, whether it's Hawthorne, or whether it is Simms, or whether it is countless other American writers, they begin to write about those things that are familiar to them. A group of leading Charlestonians in 1828 write of their regret that the state of mental dependence of our brethren of the East and North, in which we have so long contentedly remained, needs to be addressed. In 1835, the Southern Literary Journal appears in Charleston, hoping to breathe a Southern spirit. But this is not a separatist spirit at all. This is how we are going to contribute to the literature of our country. And so Simms is but one example, and if you know Simms's work, much of which is no longer readily available, you know that he writes a series of historical romances about the Revolution in South Carolina, a subject that, frankly, even today, more Americans should know more about than they do, but with the upcoming observance of the 250th, perhaps they will, and with the good work going on in this place and in other places, South Carolina's role in the Revolution, I think, will be duly and appropriately recognized. Simms writes about that. Simms writes about characters that he knows in the South. Sims writes in probably his best work, known as the Yemassee, about the conflict between the Native American and the Anglo-American civilizations. And he views with sympathy what that clash involves and how that clash turns out. This is a contribution to the store of American literature that happens to be Southern. And yet, as time goes on, and even though Sims made almost annual pilgrimages to New York to meet with publishers to get his works published, and even though his audience was national and not simply Southern, as time goes on, he becomes more and more persuaded that the North and South cannot continue to get along. We'll return to that in just a moment. Let's look at another example, though, first. 70 to 75% of the Southern church-going population were either Baptists or Methodists. And that means that whenever something of significance happened in a Baptist or a Methodist church, a significant portion of the Southern population was affected. Well, what do we see going on here? We see, once again, an attempt, and in this case a successful attempt, to intrude the slavery question into the workings of those two denominations, both the Baptists and the Methodists. And the result is ominous. First, in 1844, the Baptist Triennial Convention assembles in Philadelphia. And I'll read to you just a short segment of what takes place there. They met to consider the nomination of a Georgia slaveholder, James E. Reeves, as a missionary. Georgia Baptists urged his selection, as it will stop the mouths of gainsayers. But the society rejects Reeves, who was the first slaveholding candidate since the Compromise, claiming that his nomination would, by introducing the slavery question, violate earlier agreements. Well, this is just the beginning of a split that continues to affect the Baptist Church, and it leads to a separation of the Baptists into the Southern Baptist Convention and I suppose the Baptist Convention. And the only thing really separating the two is that in the founding documents of the Southern Baptist Convention, there is an explicit mention of slavery. But in fact, in every other respect, these denominations remain essentially the same thing. Almost simultaneously, the Methodists go through a similar controversy and crisis with a similar result. Again, let me just read to you a short segment here about what happens at the 1844, the General Conference of Methodism. Bishop James Andrew of Georgia becomes the focus of debate. He's been a bishop since his unopposed election in 1832. In 1844, after the death of his first wife, Andrew remarries. Since his second wife had inherited slaves from the estate of her first husband, he immediately initiated legal proceedings renouncing personal ownership of these black laborers. But when a number of anti-slavery delegates, including some moderate Southerners, including many moderates who were offended by Southern attacks and feared further Northern defections, informed Andrew they would vote to remove him from office. Well, they don't need to do that. He resigns his office, except for the fact that Southern delegates say, no, you can't. We're not going to allow you to resign. The debate continues to rage, and the result, again, short-circuiting the longer and more complicated story. The Methodists split as well over the issue of Bishop Andrew, over the issue of slavery. 75% of the Southern church-going population after 1845 began attending every week, and maybe more than every week, Not the Baptist Church, but the Southern Baptist Church. Not the Methodist Church, but the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Both resulting from the conflict over slavery. One could go on and on in other areas. One can look at economic development. One can look at education. And just very briefly, most of the colleges that were founded, not just in the South, but in the North, were small and were generally founded by religious denominations. Harvard, in the pre-Civil War era, was not a great national university. It was a very good college. A group of Southern bishops, Episcopalians, come together and say what this country needs and what the South needs is a great national university. It should be an Episcopal university because we have the resources and we have the connections to be able to make that happen. And we believe it should be in the South. And so after considerable discussion and debate, they decide upon a site geographically central to the South on the Cumberland Plateau in Tennessee, and established formally in 1857 the University of the South. Now make no mistake about it, by this time there are those who see in this a protection of Southern interests, Southern attitudes, Southern values against what is coming to be seen as a more hostile Northern attack. Leonidas Polk is a slaveholder, and he is one of the three founders of the University of the South. But it has in view so much more than that. It has in view creating what would eventually become the model for the private comprehensive university. This is Johns Hopkins, a generation before Johns Hopkins. This is the University of Chicago, a generation before the University of Chicago. This is taking 5,000 acres on a mountaintop and populating it with colleges of different sizes, graduate and professional schools of all sorts, and becoming a great Southern/national university. University raises $1 million, lays the cornerstone in 1860, untimely. Every dollar is lost, every building is destroyed. The university comes back to life, but in a very different form in 1868. The point of all of this is that religion, which meant so much to so many Americans, including Southerners, plays a significant role and has a significant impact on this course of the South toward an understanding of separate nationality. But it's in the realm of politics that we see this most vividly. Keep in mind that the territorial question had been largely settled in 1820. But with the annexation of Texas in 1845, and then with the outbreak of the Mexican War in 1846, the territorial question intrudes once again. And a congressman from Pennsylvania, David Wilmot, rises in the House of Representatives in 1846 and says any territory that is acquired as a result of the Mexican War is going to be prohibited to slaves and slave holders. That measure passes the House. It fails in the Senate, and it fails in the Senate because of Southern votes. But it is yet another sign, it's another signal, it's another red flag that this question of slavery may not be able to continue to be suppressed. The churches tried to suppress it, they couldn't. Congress and the political parties had tried successfully thus far to suppress it. But once the war is over and once the territory is acquired, some policy has to be developed to deal with these new territories. Simplest thing, according to some representatives and senators, would have been to extend the Missouri Compromise line westward to the Pacific, above, below. That won't do. Southerners believe that they had helped to win this war, that they should be able to take their property wherever they wish. Anti-slavery supporters believe that no, we can confine slavery to where it is. We shouldn't allow it to expand beyond its current boundaries. And among the many things that the territorial dispute allows is for those of an anti-slavery persuasion who previously had no policy outlet for their attitudes now to have one. And so moderate anti-slavery advocates who would have nothing to do with these radical abolitionists say, well, you know what, we agree, we shouldn't interfere with slavery where it exists. But we have real reservations about allowing it to expand. That is Abraham Lincoln's position. That is the free soil position. And that is a position that ultimately comes to a head first in the decision over the admission of California to the Union in 1850, which upsets the balance in the Senate. It is revived in 1854 with a debate over what to do with the Kansas and the Nebraska territories. It is exacerbated still further when President James Buchanan, in his inaugural address in 1857, says, "Don't worry. The Supreme Court is about to decide the slavery and the territory question once and for all." And we all know that when the Supreme Court speaks, that's that. What he had in mind, of course, was the Dred Scott decision, and the decision that held that basically any restrictions on the right of a property owner to take his property anywhere he chose were unconstitutional. That not only throws out the Missouri Compromise, it leads to a further separation between the sections over the question of slavery, over the question of the territorial limits of slavery, and over the degree to which that becomes an issue requiring drastic action. It is clear demographically that the population in the non-slave holding states is growing. It is clear that this new emerging Republican Party is going to be a force to be reckoned with, and many of the erstwhile abolitionists join the Republican Party. And while many Republicans, like Lincoln, are of the anti-slavery as opposed to the abolitionist stripe, nevertheless, in the eyes of more and more Southerners, this group, this Republican Party, is coming to constitute a hostile majority. And that whole question of the relationship of majority rule and minority rights, which has been present in the political arena since the beginning of American nationhood, now presents itself with new vigor and new urgency in the 1850s. Writers like Sims become increasingly in favor of withdrawal from the Union. In response to the Compromise of 1850, a Southern Rights Association is founded in South Carolina. There are scattered outbreaks isn't the right word, scattered expressions of secession sentiment during the California debate. And while they seem to subside after the Compromise of 1850 is arrived at, as the decade of the 1850s go on, those concerns continue to grow. And there comes to be a division within the Southern political leadership between individuals like Jefferson Davis, who still harbor the hope that a national party can help resolve this national dispute, and those like Robert Barnwell Rhett and William Lowndes Yancey, the so-called fire eaters, who have been arguing, some like Rhett, since the late 1820s, that it's time to break up the Union. But Rhett was as an extreme proponent of secession as William Lloyd Garrison was of abolition. They represent the two extremes that really didn't have much of a following or much credibility during so much of the first half of the 19th century. But as slavery begins to rise, whether it's in the churches, whether it's in politics, wherever one looks, slavery becomes, as Thomas Dew, I believe it was, once put it, the great distinguishing characteristic. And so, despite all of those things that made Northerners and Southerners essentially alike, it was this one thing, this one big thing, this one fundamental thing, this one irrepressible thing, to use William Seward's words, that eventually caused the country to break apart. Now, it's interesting to look at the language employed first in South Carolina in December of 1860. The response to the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 in this state is to call a convention to determine the state's future in the Union. Now, this whole idea of convention is very important too. Legislatures can make statutes. Statutes can be made and unmade. The next Congress can change the law that the previous Congress enacted. That's not the way it should be or has been with constitutions. Constitutions are fundamental laws. Constitutions need to be placed beyond the reach of legislative bodies. Fundamental law and statute law are not the same. And so, whether we're talking about 1787, 88, where the decision to ratify the Constitution was not by a popular vote, but rather by a Constitution called for a particular purpose, to do a particular thing at a particular time, and then to dissolve itself forever, never to come back in that same form again. When the time comes to deliberate on a state's relationship to the Union, we're not going to put this to a popular vote. We're going to call a convention. We're going to call a constitutional convention. And that's exactly what South Carolina does. And when that convention assembles in December of 1860, it takes a vote. And while the consequences of that vote are to remove South Carolina from the Union, the actual vote is to repeal the ratification of the Constitution that was voted up in 1788. And so, while it may seem pettifoggery to say that this was not a vote on secession, clearly the consequence of that vote was essentially a vote to secede. Nevertheless, the actual vote was to undo what a previous convention had done. And that is a question that ultimately was subjected not to a test of argument, but to a test of arms. But the decision was to change our minds about what we had done in 1788. Now that ought to tell us something as well about what this new thing called the Confederate States of America might be. And one of the great themes, it seems to me, of Civil War history is the way in which nationality really comes into practice. A number of historians have written about this, comparing the impact of war in North and South and seeing surprising similarities. First National Conscription Act, for example, is enacted by the Confederate Congress. The Confederacy has a national draft law before the United States does. Whether we're talking about a common currency, whether we're talking about a standard rail gauge, whether we're talking about uniform sizes for uniforms and boots, weapons, the Civil War has a genuinely nationalizing impact of the sort that it would have taken decades otherwise to achieve in the absence of the pressures of war. But even more than all of that, which is another story for another time, take a quick look at the constitutions of the two enterprises. The Confederate Constitution is a virtual duplicate of the United States Constitution, with several notable exceptions. One is a fixed single 6-year term for the president. Next time you find yourself engaged in that discussion with people who believe that we should have that now, point out to them that, well, the Confederate Constitution actually had that in it. Another difference was the line item veto. Jefferson Davis had the line item veto. That pops up from time to time too, and you may just want to point out to your friends, well, you think line item veto is a good thing. The Federal Constitution had that. But of course, in a way, I'm dodging the main point, because the Confederate Constitution also explicitly recognizes slavery, which the Federal Constitution does not. And so the result of all of this is the creation of two separate nations, each of which believes itself to be the true version of the American nation, each of which has considerable evidence on its side to support that claim. Lincoln's being the proposition that all men are created equal. Davis's being that, hey, we had a contract in 1787 and you folks are threatening to violate it. And we see the rupturing of the country, the loss of life, and struggles that in some ways persist down to our own time. One could do worse than to answer that question, if you're writing the history of the South, where would you begin, than by choosing 1861, or perhaps even more appropriately, 1865. Because with defeat and with Reconstruction and with occupation, the Confederate States experienced something, as C. Van Woodward has put out, that no other part of America has ever experienced. But wherever you begin that narrative, there is no question that many of the most basic questions of nationality are worked out, or try to be worked out, during this period, and don't ever call it antebellum. If you ever hear somebody use that term, antebellum, ask them what they would do if they were walking down the streets of Philadelphia or walking down the streets of Charleston in 1845, and someone were to come up to them and say, "So, how are things going in antebellum America?" What bellum are we ante? One of the great challenges to an historian is, just because we know the outcome of the story, to shape the narrative as a result of that knowledge. Americans in 1845, Americans in 1855 didn't know that there would be a war. They didn't believe or know that this conflict was irrepressible. They thought they were much more alike than different. And the fact is, they were, even perhaps in their racial attitudes. And so if there is a tragedy in our Civil War, it is the fact that in this quest for nationality, we somehow were not able to deal with that most irrepressible, most fundamental of questions, which remain to this day a proposition being tested still. Let me close with one of my favorite lines of poetry. Stephen Vincent Benet, John Brown's Body, an epic poem about the Civil War. If I were to read it to you in its entirety, we'd be here for another 3 hours. I won't do that. But he refers at the closing of that poem to the South as the America we have not been. That seems to me to be a pretty good way of thinking about it. There were two competing definitions of American nationality. We see that competition much more evidently in retrospect. We see in the way in which the American literary canon has been defined largely in terms of New England and the North. We see it in a whole host of other ways as well. It's the America we have not been. The tropic empire seeking the warm sea. The last foray of aristocracy, based not on dollars or initiative or any blood for what that blood was worth, but on a certain code, a manner of birth, a certain manner of knowing how to live, the pastoral rebellion of the earth against machines, against the age of steam. Bury this destiny unmanifest, this system broken underneath the test. And then he concludes with a warning to anyone who would presume to claim the mantle of any particular heritage as entirely or exclusively one's own. So when the crowd gives tongue and prophets, old or young, bawl out their strange despair or fall in worship there, let them applaud the image or condemn, but keep your distance and your soul from them. And if the heart within your breast must burst like a cracked crucible and pour its steel white hot before the white heat of the wheel, while the prophets shudder or adore before the flame, hoping it will give ear. If you at last must have a word to say, say neither in their way, it is a deadly magic and accursed, nor it is blessed, but only it is here. This is the story of the America we might have been, but have not been. It's the story of imperfect human beings, imperfectly comprehending the world in which they lived, trying to make sense of it, living within its realities, and discovering that in really only one way, but in an ultimately fundamental way, they could no longer get along. The idea of a southern nation, therefore, becomes that America we have not been. And we can only say in conclusion, not that it is a deadly magic and accursed, nor that it is blessed, but simply, it is here. Thank you all very much for your attention.